What would you do if the person you trusted most, the person you were about to give your name, your future, and your entire world to, was quietly destroying the one person in your life who never asked for anything in return? What would you do if that destruction was happening right inside your own home, behind your back, in rooms you never thought to check, by hands you had placed a ring on? And what would happen if the person who finally saw it, the person who finally said enough, was someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose, a young woman who arrived at your door with 2 bags, a business degree, and a father's voice in her chest telling her that you do not walk past something wrong? This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of what happened when Ethan Montgomery, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, almost lost the most important thing in his life because he was too busy being successful to notice it disappearing. And it is the story of Lily Carter, the maid who stole his heart. Not because she tried to, but because she was exactly who she was, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right house. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. I need you to think about the last time you were in a room with someone you had given up on, not because they were cruel, not because anything catastrophic had happened, but simply because the silence between you had stretched so long and gone so deep that you had quietly, privately, stopped believing it could ever be crossed. Maybe it was a marriage. Maybe it was a friendship. Maybe it was a parent or a sibling or someone you loved and had slowly, painfully let go of. I need you to hold that feeling. Because that is exactly where Ethan and Sophia were. Now I need you to ask yourself 3 questions. And I want you to sit with them, because we are going to answer every single one of them before this story is done. The first question is this: how does a man who has spent his entire adult life behind a wall of control and emotional distance finally crack open, and what does it take to get there? The second question: what does a woman do when she discovers, in the worst possible way, that the man she had given up on had been falling in love with her all along, in the silence, in the distance, in every small, private moment she had assumed meant nothing? And the third question, and this is the one that should keep you awake: if you had already made the decision, already told the attorneys to proceed, already grieved the loss and started to make peace with moving on, would you have been brave enough to stop? Ethan and Sophia Cole were married on the 14th of April, 18 months before this story reaches its climax. They were married in a ceremony that cost more than most people earn in a year, in front of 200 guests who had not the faintest idea that the couple at the altar had spoken to each other in person exactly 3 times before that day. 3 times. 3 carefully arranged meetings, each chaperoned, each formal, each lasting no more than 2 hours. 3 meetings between 2 people who were being asked to build a life together. They did not hold hands during the ceremony unless they had to. They stood at that altar composed and beautiful, 2 young people from 2 powerful families performing the roles they had been prepared to perform. And when the officiant said "you may kiss the bride," it was brief, and it was careful, and it said everything about what the next 18 months were going to look like. But it also said something else, something neither of them understood yet. It said, "We are here. We showed up. We made a choice." And choices, even the ones that feel like obligations, have a way of meaning more than you expect them to, given enough time. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. This one is just getting started. The Montgomery estate sat on Belmont Ridge Drive in Greenwich, Connecticut, and it was the kind of property that made people slow their cars down when they drove past it. For stories of white colonial architecture with symmetrical columns framing the front entrance, floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the light at every hour of the day, a circular stone driveway with a carved fountain at its center, and rose gardens on both sides of the property that a full-time gardener maintained 3 days a week. It was not simply a house. It was a statement. It was the physical evidence of a life built with extraordinary ambition and extraordinary success. And it belonged to Ethan Montgomery, a 34-year-old man who had started with nothing but his own intelligence, his own relentless work ethic, and $100,000 of his own savings, and had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the United States. Ethan Montgomery's company was called Meridian Technologies, and by the time this story takes place, it had just been valued at $2.4 billion. He had been named to Forbes 40 Under 40 list for the third consecutive year. His face had appeared on the cover of Fortune magazine twice. He employed over 400 people, and every single one of them, if you asked them privately what it was like to work for him, would tell you the same thing: he was the real thing. Not a man who had been handed his position. Not a man propped up by connections or inherited advantage. A man who had genuinely built something from the ground up, who remembered every person's name in his company, who asked questions because he actually wanted the answers, and who carried the weight of his responsibilities with a quiet, grounded seriousness that made the people around him feel, strangely, safe. That was the public Ethan Montgomery. That was the man the world saw. But there was something the world did not see. There was something happening inside that beautiful estate on Belmont Ridge Drive that no Forbes profile would ever capture. Inside that house, on the second floor of the East Wing, in a bedroom with a large window overlooking the Rose Garden, lived Eleanor Montgomery. 78 years old. Silver white hair in a soft, elegant style. Kind blue eyes that still held decades of warmth and intelligence behind them. Ethan's mother. The woman who had raised him, who had worked 2 jobs so he could stay in the school with the better mathematics program, who had co-signed the original loan on this very property when Ethan was 27 years old and the bank needed an older co-borrower. Eleanor Montgomery was the reason there was an Ethan Montgomery at all. She was the foundation under everything he had built. And she was being treated, in her own son's house, like she was an inconvenience. Like she was something to be managed. Like she was already gone. People who knew Eleanor Montgomery before all of this would describe her in the same way. They would say she was unbreakable. They would say she was the kind of woman who had weathered every difficulty life had placed in front of her without complaint and without collapse, the kind of woman who got up at 5 in the morning because the work needed doing, who laughed at dinner even when money was short, who told her son every single day of his childhood that he was capable of more than the world had yet imagined for him. She had been, by every account, a remarkable woman. And she still was. But something had happened to her in the months before this story begins. Something slow and quiet and relentless, the way erosion works, not dramatic, not sudden, just the same pressure applied in the same place, over and over, until something that was once solid begins to give way. Eleanor had not slept soundly in months. She had started to hesitate before going downstairs. She had begun checking the hallway before she moved through it, the way people check for traffic before crossing a street. She had stopped coming to dinner when there were guests. She had stopped asking for things she needed, because asking had become a complicated calculation. Would the request be met with coldness, with an impatient sigh, with that particular tilted head patience that was performed for audiences and felt, up close, like a door being shut in her face? She had started to feel like a guest in a house she had helped build. And the worst part, the part that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of woman Eleanor Montgomery was that she had not told her son. Not because she could not. But because she loved him. And she had decided that his happiness mattered more than her comfort. She had decided to wait. She just did not know yet what she was waiting for. Victoria Harrington was 31 years old, and she was the kind of beautiful that entire rooms noticed. Tall, slender, with high cheekbones, sharp green eyes, and chestnut hair that she wore in a perfect sleek blowout or an artful updo, depending on the occasion. She dressed exclusively in designer clothing, tailored blazers, silk blouses, structured gowns, and she moved through every space she entered with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who has never once needed to question whether she belonged there. Her father was Richard Harrington of the Philadelphia Harringtons, old money, old name, old power. The kind of family whose name appeared in the founding documents of several institutions and whose social connections extended to places most people only read about. Victoria had grown up inside that world, and it had shaped her in the way that worlds do when you are formed by them before you are old enough to choose differently. She had learned very early that beauty and breeding were currencies, that the right name opened the right doors, and that managing how people perceived you was simply a skill, like any other, that rewarded consistent practice. Around Ethan Montgomery, Victoria was extraordinary. She remembered the small things, his preferred coffee order, the name of the first company he had ever pitched and lost, the specific way he liked to spend his few free hours. She laughed at exactly the right moments. She looked at him in public with an expression that communicated, to everyone watching, that she considered him the most important person in any room they entered together. She was warm and attentive and present in all the ways that a man who worked 14-hour days and rarely had time to eat properly found genuinely comforting. Ethan had met her at a charity auction in Manhattan 2 years before this story takes place, and he had been drawn in almost immediately, not because he was naive, but because around him, she was everything she had decided to be. The trouble was that around Eleanor Montgomery, when Ethan was not present, Victoria Harrington was something else entirely. She was the version of herself that she had spent 2 years very carefully keeping him from meeting. The first time Victoria spoke to Eleanor with the voice she kept hidden from Ethan, it was over a ceramic vase. Italian, cream with hand-painted blue flowers, a gift from a family called the Brentwoods. Eleanor had been rearranging books on her own bedroom shelf when the vase slipped from her fingers. Her hands trembled sometimes, it was simply something that came with age. The vase hit the floor and broke. Before Eleanor had even drawn the breath to say she was sorry, Victoria appeared in the doorway. And the voice she used, controlled, flat, cold, was not the voice Ethan knew. It said, "That was a gift from the Brentwoods, Eleanor. Do you understand what that means? Please. Just don't touch things that don't belong to you." Then she turned and walked out, phone in hand, as though Eleanor and the broken vase were simply two problems she had already moved past. And Eleanor stood alone in the bright kitchen among the pieces, very still, because she was not the kind of woman who cried in kitchens. But something inside her had cracked that day, right along with the Italian ceramic. And it did not fully heal. Ethan Montgomery was one of the most perceptive men in any boardroom he entered. He had spent 10 years reading people, their motivations, their hidden agendas, the specific gap between what they said and what they meant, because in business, that gap was where the danger lived. He had walked out of rooms full of hostile investors with everything he came for because he understood, instinctively, how people worked. He could read a room the way other people read a clock, quickly, automatically, without even trying. But he had a blind spot. And like most blind spots, it had been created by something that had happened long before Victoria, long before Meridian Technologies, long before the estate on Belmont Ridge Drive. It had been created by his father. Not by anything dramatic. Not by one defining moment. But by the accumulation of 1,000 small, quiet cruelties that Ethan had watched his father deliver to his mother across the years of his childhood, things that left no marks anyone could point to but that shaped everything about how young Ethan understood love and cruelty and the difference between them. He had grown up watching a man hurt a woman in invisible ways. And it had created in him a powerful, unconscious gratitude for any woman who was simply kind to him. He confused kindness toward him with kindness as a character trait. He forgot, or perhaps he had never been taught, that the real test of a person's character is not how they treat the people they want something from. It is how they treat the people who cannot do anything for them at all. His mother had tried to tell him. Once. She had called him on a Wednesday evening, and her voice had the careful, measured quality of a woman choosing each word like she was stepping on stones across a river, trying to get to the other side without slipping into the cold water. She had said, "Ethan, honey, Victoria isn't always the way she is when you're around. When you're not home, and then she had paused, because she could not find the word that was honest without being irreversible. And Ethan had heard the pause the way a man hears something that threatens his peace and had responded the way men in that position respond. He had said, gently and firmly, "Mom. I know you had a different picture in your head for who I'd bring home. But Victoria is a good woman. Please just give her more time." Eleanor had said, "All right, sweetheart." And she had not pushed again. Because she loved him too much to become the person who stood between him and his happiness, even if his happiness was built on something that was not what he thought it was. So she had gone back to the second floor of the East Wing. She had gone back to waiting. She had gone back to checking the hallway before she moved through it. And Victoria had gone back to being exactly who she was when Ethan was not watching. The pattern of control that Victoria exercised over Eleanor's daily life was not dramatic. It was precise. It was the kind of thing that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced it, because no single instance is catastrophic enough to justify the alarm it produces in the person receiving it. Eleanor's meals arrived late, not always, not dramatically, just often enough that eating became something that happened on Victoria's schedule rather than Eleanor's hunger. Staff requests that Eleanor made were quietly moved to the bottom of every list until Victoria's preferences had been fully attended to. At dinner parties, Victoria would address Eleanor in front of guests with a patient, tilted head tolerance. "Eleanor, we've talked about this, haven't we, sweetheart?" As though the older woman were gently confused, gently forgetting, gently requiring management. And then Victoria would smile at the guests with the expression of a woman enduring something graciously, and the guests would nod and admire her patience, and Eleanor would sit in the knowledge that she had just been publicly redefined as a problem. It was sophisticated. It was nearly invisible. And it was working. Until the Monday morning in October when Lily Carter knocked on Eleanor Montgomery's bedroom door and sat down and asked if there was anything she needed. Until the moment when one honest woman walked into a house full of performance and simply refused to perform. Lily Carter was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, in a neighborhood east of the historic district where the Spanish moss hung from the live oak trees and the streets were quiet enough that children played outside until the streetlights came on. Her father, James Carter, had run a hardware store on the same corner block for 23 years, a modest, clean, well-maintained store with a hand-painted sign and an American flag by the door and a reputation among the neighborhood for being the kind of place where you got what you paid for and were treated like a person while you paid for it. Her mother, Ruth, had taught third grade at the local elementary school for nearly as long. They were not wealthy people. They were something the wealth of that particular era was not always good at producing. They were honest people. People who paid what they owed and returned what was not theirs and looked strangers in the eye because looking away felt like lying. James Carter had raised his children with a principle he stated simply and lived loudly every single day of his life. You do not walk past something wrong. God put eyes in your head for a reason. He never had to say it more than once to any of his children, because he never said it without first demonstrating it himself. Lily had grown up with that principle the way children grow up with their mother tongue. It was simply the language in which she understood the world. It shaped the decisions she made before she was old enough to call them decisions. It was why she returned the wallet she found on a Savannah sidewalk when she was 14, with every dollar still inside, even though she had exactly $9 of her own. It was why she spoke up when her college roommate was being talked about badly by the other girls in their dormitory, even when staying quiet would have been easier and safer. It was why, at the small accounting firm where she worked after graduation, she refused to sign her name to a financial report that had been padded with numbers she knew were false, even when it cost her the promotion she had been working toward for 18 months. She had gone home that evening, sat on her father's front porch, and told him what she had done. He had listened to all of it. Then he had nodded once and said, "Sleep well tonight." She had. And she had understood then that the principle was not just something he had taught her. It was a kind of armor. And it went with her everywhere. She was 25 years old when the accounting firm folded. The senior partner had retired unexpectedly and the practice had not survived the transition. Lily had rent overdue, her younger brother Marcus had 2 semesters left at community college and their parents had stretched themselves as far as they could go to keep him enrolled, and her mother's blood pressure medication had become a monthly expense that was not optional. She had a business degree and a clean work history and a strong reference from her former employer and currently no income. When a placement agency in Stamford, Connecticut posted a listing for a live-in household position with a high-profile family, full room and board, competitive salary, 1 primary resident and 1 elderly parent in residence, Lily had read it 3 times. She had put her phone down and picked it back up. She had thought about her degree and her plans and the specific trajectory she had imagined for her life. And then she had thought about Marcus's tuition and her mother's medication and the overdue rent. And she had applied. She was not ashamed of it. Her father's principle applied here too. There was no shame in honest work. Only in dishonest comfort. She arrived at the Montgomery estate on a Monday morning in early October, wearing a pressed navy dress and carrying 2 neat bags and a professional shoulder bag. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patricia Webb, a composed, gray-templed woman who had worked for the Montgomery family for 11 years, met her at the side entrance and walked her through the property with the efficiency of someone who had conducted this orientation before and intended to do it correctly. The rules were numerous and specific. Main staircase for family and guests only. Staff use the east stairwell. Do not enter the west wing without prior permission. Do not engage Miss Harrington's guests unless directly addressed. Do not enter Miss Harrington's morning routine before 10 a.m. All staff requests through Mrs. Webb. Lily listened to all of it without comment, noting privately that most of the rules had been designed not to maintain order but to maintain invisibility. She filed that observation away. Then she asked about Eleanor Montgomery. Mrs. Webb paused. Just a fraction of a second, barely a breath. She turned and looked at Lily with an expression that carried something careful and specific behind it. Then she said, "Take very good care of her. She is a good woman." The way she said it told Lily more than the sentence contained. She met Eleanor Montgomery that same afternoon. The older woman was sitting in the armchair near the window of her second-floor bedroom, a book open in her lap but her eyes resting on the autumn garden below. She looked up when Lily knocked and entered, and her blue eyes moved over the young woman with the careful, measured appraisal of someone who has been disappointed by first impressions before and has learned to wait for evidence. Lily smiled, genuinely, not professionally, the way she smiled at her mother's kitchen table, and said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Montgomery. My name is Lily Carter. I've been assigned to help around the house, and specifically to look after you. Is there anything you need right now, or anywhere you'd like to go this afternoon?" There was a pause. Eleanor looked at her for a long, still moment. Then she said something that Lily would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "Sit with me for a few minutes. I'm tired of this room feeling like a place I've been put." So Lily sat. And they talked. About small things first, the drive from Atlanta, the way the Connecticut autumn light fell differently from the Georgia light she was used to. Then bigger things. About Savannah, which Eleanor had visited once with her late husband William and never forgotten. About Ruth Carter's cooking, which Lily described so precisely and warmly that Eleanor laughed, a real, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes before you can manage it. By the time the afternoon light changed, something had settled between them. Not friendship yet. But recognition. The particular kind that happens when two people with similar hearts find each other without expecting to. It took 3 days. Lily had been in the house for 72 hours when she witnessed it for herself. She was upstairs in Eleanor's bedroom, changing the linens. She had noticed they were stiff and stale, and she had simply gone to find softer ones from the linen closet without being asked, when she heard Victoria's voice in the corridor outside. The tone was wrong from the first syllable. Not raised. Not theatrical. Something colder and more deliberate than either of those things. The tone of a person who has stopped pretending and is now simply being themselves. Lily moved to the door, quietly, and listened through the gap. Victoria was speaking to Eleanor about the silver walker that Eleanor had left leaning against the banister on the landing. She was explaining, in a measured, flat voice, that the walker was a hazard, that it reflected poorly on the management of the household, that Eleanor needed to consider how things looked to people who visited. Then she told Eleanor that she would be hosting a dinner that weekend and that she needed Eleanor to remain in her room for the duration of the evening. She said, "The last time you came downstairs during one of our events, Ethan was embarrassed." And then, at the end, in a tone that was almost conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse, she said, "You're not a young woman anymore, Eleanor. The sooner you start behaving like that, the easier this will be." For everyone. Lily stood behind the door and did not move. Something passed through her in that moment that she would later struggle to describe to the people who asked her about it. It was not simple anger, though anger was certainly part of it. It was something deeper and older and more specific, the thing that had been named for her by her father on a Savannah front porch years before she understood why she would need it. It was the feeling that arrives precisely at the moment you realize you are standing at the crossroads between looking away and not looking away. She heard Victoria's heels move down the corridor. She waited one breath. Then she opened the door. Eleanor was standing in the hallway, very straight, very still, holding her walker with both hands, working with everything she had to keep her face from showing what was happening behind it. Lily walked to her. She took her arm gently and said, "Come inside, Mrs. Montgomery. Let me get you some water and we can sit for a bit." Eleanor nodded, one small, careful nod, and turned. As she turned, Lily caught a glimpse of what lived behind those clear blue eyes. Not self-pity. Not simple sadness. Something that had been worn down over many months into something closer to exhaustion. The deep, accumulating kind that settles in a person when the same wound is reopened in the same place, repeatedly, with nowhere to put the grief of it. That night, alone in her small staff room on the 3rd floor, Lily Carter sat on the edge of her bed and made a decision. She did not know yet what it would cost her. She did not know yet what it would change. She only knew that she was not going to pretend she had not seen what she had seen. Her father's voice was in her chest. She was not going to walk past this. Victoria's Saturday dinner party was the kind of event that required every person in the household to perform their role without deviation. The caterers arrived at noon with vans full of equipment. A florist arranged white orchid installations on every surface of the main floor. A wine specialist made 3 trips from a refrigerated truck. Victoria moved through the house with her personal assistant trailing behind her, directing the preparation with the brisk, practiced authority of someone who had hosted events like this her entire life and expected them to be perfect because they always were. She had arranged everything with precision. She had told Eleanor to stay upstairs. She had confirmed with the cook that a dinner tray would be brought to Eleanor's room no later than 7 o'clock. She had positioned everything so that her future mother-in-law would remain quietly out of sight, out of any conversation, and entirely absent from the evening. From Victoria's perspective, the logistics were organized. The variable had been managed. She turned her attention fully to the party. At 7:15, no meal had arrived at Eleanor's room. Lily had been watching the clock. She had confirmed with the cook at 6:30 that a tray was being prepared. But the caterers had taken over the kitchen entirely, and in the controlled chaos of a 12-course dinner service, Eleanor's simple tray had been forgotten. Not maliciously forgotten. Simply forgotten, in the way that the needs of a person who has been made to seem unimportant are always the first things forgotten when attention is scarce. Lily went to the kitchen. The cook, overwhelmed, apologetic, genuinely unable to step away from his station, spread his hands and said he could not help her right now. Lily said nothing. She tied an apron over her dress, found a clear corner of the counter that the caterers were not using, and made Eleanor's dinner herself. Roasted chicken. Mashed sweet potato. Green beans. A cup of chamomile tea, because she had noticed over 3 days that Eleanor made herself chamomile every evening before bed, and details like that were the kind of thing Lily paid attention to. She arranged it on a tray carefully, the way you arrange things for a specific person rather than a general meal, and carried it upstairs herself while the dinner party conversation swelled 2 floors below her. When she knocked and pushed open the door to Eleanor's room, the older woman was sitting in the near darkness with her hands folded in her lap and the television off. She had not called anyone. She had not pressed the house phone to ask where her meal was. She had simply been waiting. In the specific silence of a woman who has learned, over many months, that asking for things makes the asking harder than the not having. She looked at the tray Lily set on the side table. She looked at the chamomile tea. She looked at Lily for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice she was keeping carefully level, you made this yourself?" Lily nodded. "The kitchen was tied up with the caterers," she said. "I hope the chicken is all right, I kept it simple." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Lily did not expect. She said, "Sit down, Lily. Please. Eat with me." It was not a direction. It was an invitation between equals, which is the rarest kind of invitation, and the kind that means the most. So they ate together in that quiet room while the dinner party went on 2 floors below them, and the sound of crystal and laughter rose faintly through the floor, and neither of them mentioned it, because what was happening in that small room, a simple meal, real company, 2 women being honest with each other, was more substantial than anything happening downstairs. They ate together that night in the small warm circle of Eleanor's bedroom lamp, while the party sounds drifted upward through the floor beneath them. The chamomile tea went from hot to warm. The chicken was simple and good. Eleanor asked about Savannah and Lily told her about the way the light fell through the Spanish moss in the late afternoon and the way her mother hummed while cooking and the specific way her father closed up the hardware store at the end of the day, turning the sign, checking the lock twice, pausing on the step the way a man pauses when he has done something well and is simply acknowledging that before moving on. Eleanor listened to all of it with the full presence of a woman who had been starved of simple conversation for a long time and was now drinking it in carefully, the way you drink something when you are not sure when you will have it again. And Lily, watching Eleanor's face in the lamplight, understood for the first time the full weight of what had been happening in this house. It was not just the cold meals or the managed staff or the corridor confrontations. It was this. The theft of ordinary human warmth. The slow removal of the simple daily things that tell a person they are seen and valued and present in the world. That was what Victoria Harrington had been taking from Eleanor Montgomery. And that was what Lily Carter had simply and quietly given back. The confrontation that would change the entire trajectory of this story happened on a Sunday afternoon, 12 days after Lily Carter arrived at the Montgomery estate. Ethan was away. He had flown to Chicago 3 days earlier for an acquisition meeting that was running long, and he was not expected back before Tuesday evening. Victoria had invited 2 of her closest friends to the house, women as polished and as certain of themselves as she was, and the 3 of them had settled into the sunroom with wine and a cheese board and the particular ease of people who have always been comfortable and have never had cause to question their right to be. The sunroom was bright and warm with afternoon light, and the conversation moved lightly between events and people and places that occupied the specific altitude of their shared social world. It was a pleasant Sunday. It was the kind of afternoon that Victoria was very good at constructing. And it would have continued exactly that way, except that Eleanor Montgomery had come downstairs. She had wanted a cup of tea and one of the shortbread cookies she kept in a small tin in the kitchen cupboard. A Sunday afternoon thing. A simple, ordinary, entirely reasonable thing for a woman to want in her own son's house on a Sunday. She had moved carefully through the corridor with her walker, intending to pass through the edge of the main floor quietly and reach the kitchen without disturbing anyone. She miscalculated the route slightly. She came too close to the sunroom doorway. Victoria looked up from her wine glass. The word she said, "Eleanor," landed in the bright room like something dropped from a height. The afternoon fractured. Victoria's friends looked up. Eleanor stopped. She steadied herself on her walker and said, with the quiet dignity she had been practicing for months, "I was just going to get some tea, I didn't mean to," and Victoria said, smoothly, without raising her voice at all, "We talked about this. I have guests. This is not a good time for you to be wandering through the house." And she glanced at her friends, a small, inclusive glance, the particular social gesture that said, "Do you see what I deal with?" and began to turn back to her conversation, as though Eleanor had already gone. Eleanor Montgomery stood in the doorway of her son's sunroom. 78 years old. The woman who had co-signed the loan on this property. The woman whose sacrifice had made the man whose name was on the deed. She stood there like a person who has just been told, politely and in front of witnesses, that she is not welcome. And something in her shoulders dropped. Just slightly. The specific, terrible small collapse that happens in a person's body when their dignity has been pushed against one too many times in one space and the body admits what the face is still refusing to show. Lily Carter had been in the hallway. She had heard every word. She stepped forward. She said, "Mrs. Montgomery. Let me walk with you to the kitchen. I'll make you your tea." She offered her arm. Eleanor took it. And Lily began to walk them both toward the kitchen. Victoria's voice came from behind. "Excuse me. I don't believe I was speaking to you." And Lily stopped. She turned around. And she looked at Victoria Harrington directly, not with hostility, not with theater, not with any of the performances that situation might have invited. She looked at her the way you look at something you have decided you are no longer going to pretend not to see. She said, "You weren't speaking to me. But Mrs. Montgomery is Ethan's mother. She lives here." She was walking through her son's home on a Sunday afternoon to get a cup of tea, and she wasn't doing a single thing wrong. "I'm making sure she gets what she needs. That is my job." She held the eye contact for 1 second longer than was comfortable. Then she turned, tucked Eleanor's arm under hers, and walked them both to the kitchen. The sunroom was completely silent. One of Victoria's friends set her wine glass down very slowly. Victoria said nothing. But her fingers tightened around the stem of her own glass until her knuckles were pale. Victoria did not say anything to Lily that Sunday. Or the next day. The silence that followed was not peace, it was the kind of silence that is gathering itself, the way weather gathers before it breaks. Lily recognized it and did not flinch from it. She had made her peace with whatever consequences were coming the moment she turned around in that hallway and said what she said. She did not regret it. She went about her work, looked after Eleanor with the same steady care she had been providing since her first day, and waited. On the third day, Victoria summoned her to the downstairs study. The word summoned is not too strong. It was delivered through Mrs. Webb with the formal precision of a person who wanted the power dynamic established before the conversation even began. Lily was shown into Ethan's study, where Victoria was sitting behind the large mahogany desk in a position that was entirely deliberate, communicating ownership of a space that was not hers. She looked at Lily for a long, measuring moment and said, "I want you out of this house by Friday. I'll be contacting the agency this afternoon. You overstepped significantly, and this is not something I'm willing to overlook." Lily stood across the desk from her. She had expected this, or something like it. She said, "I understand. I'll begin packing." She turned to leave. Victoria spoke again, and her voice had dropped into a colder register, the voice of someone who wants to make certain all the exits have been secured. She said, "And I would strongly advise you not to repeat anything you think you saw or heard in this house. Not to the agency, not to Ethan, not to anyone. People in your position would do well to remember how quickly a professional reference can be damaged." Lily paused with her hand on the doorframe. She turned back. She looked at Victoria with the clear, steady attention that Victoria found, though she would never have said so, unsettling in a person with so little institutional power. And she said, "I don't describe things inaccurately. I won't promise silence about mistreatment, regardless of who asks me. That's not something I'm able to offer." She opened the door and walked out. Victoria stared at the empty doorway. And somewhere in the house, very quietly, something that had been holding its breath for a long time began to exhale. That evening Lily sat with Eleanor and told her what had happened. Eleanor's face moved through several things quickly: concern, guilt, a sharp and fiercely protective flash that briefly made her look 30 years younger. She started to say, "Because of me," and Lily said gently but firmly, "No. Because of what's right. Those are two different things, Mrs. Montgomery." She held the older woman's hands in hers and asked the question she had been building toward since her third day in this house. She said, "Does Ethan know what happens here when he's away?" Eleanor was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is working something out rather than avoiding something. Then she said, I didn't want to cause damage between them. He cares for her. He's been so alone since his father died. I didn't want to take something from him. Lily nodded. She understood the love behind that decision. But she also understood what it was costing. She said, I know why you protected him. But staying silent to protect someone you love sometimes only protects the thing that's hurting them. Eleanor sat with that for a long time. Then she gave one small, certain nod. The kind that means something has been decided. Ethan Montgomery came home from Chicago on a Tuesday evening, later than expected. His driver pulled through the Belmont Ridge Drive gates at 9:30, and Ethan sat in the back seat for a moment in the dark with his jacket off and his tie loosened, letting the particular tiredness of 3 days of high-stakes travel settle in his shoulders. He always felt a small exhale of relief when he came through his own gates. The house, the fountain, the familiar weight of his own life, there was always a moment of it, even on the difficult evenings. He had barely set his bag down in the entrance hall when Mrs. Webb appeared at the end of the corridor. She was a composed woman. 11 years of working for him had produced in her a remarkable steadiness. She did not alarm easily, and she did not exaggerate. Which was precisely why the expression on her face tonight stopped him completely. It was the expression of a woman who has been carrying something for a long time and has run out of places to put it. He said, quietly, "What is it, Patricia?" She said, "I think you should speak with your mother before anything else this evening, sir." He looked at her for one moment. Then he went straight upstairs. He knocked on Eleanor's door, pushed it open, and the sight of her, smaller somehow than he had been expecting, the lamplight catching the tiredness around her eyes in a way he had not noticed before, or perhaps had not let himself notice, made something tighten in his chest. He sat beside her on the bed and took her hands and said, "Talk to me, Mom. All of it. Please." And she did. Quietly, without embellishment, without the careful editing she had been applying to protect him for months. She told him about the broken vase. She told him about the dinner party and the tray that never came. She told him about the corridor on Sunday afternoon, the guests, the glance Victoria had exchanged with her friends, the specific words she had chosen to deliver in front of witnesses. She told him about the pattern, the late meals, the managed staff requests, the public performances of patient tolerance that were designed to redefine Eleanor as a woman who needed managing rather than a woman who deserved respect. She told him about Lily Carter, this young woman from Savannah who had arrived 12 days ago and made her dinner with her own hands and sat with her in the dark and spoken the truth out loud in Victoria's sunroom when no one else in that house would. And she told him that Lily had been ordered out by Friday. Ethan listened without interrupting once. His face was still throughout, not cold, but still, in the specific way of a person passing through an internal reckoning that cannot be hurried. When his mother finished, neither of them spoke for a long moment. The room was very quiet. The lamp made its small warm circle of light. Then Ethan said, "Mom. I am sorry." No qualifications. No redirections. No careful management of how the apology landed. Just the words, plain and direct, carrying the full weight of what they meant. Eleanor reached up and touched the side of his face the way she had when he was 8 years old and had come home with a scraped knee, trying not to cry. She said, softly, "A man's character shows in how he treats the people who can't do anything for him. I raised you knowing that. I just needed you to remember it." He sat with that in the quiet for a long time. Then he stood up, kissed her forehead, and went to make 2 phone calls. The first was to the placement agency, to confirm that Lily Carter's position was secure and that any instructions to the contrary had been rescinded. The second was a longer conversation, one that had been building for a long time, one that he should have had much earlier. He found Lily the following morning in the back garden, rehanging Eleanor's bedroom curtains on the outdoor drying line. She had noticed the curtains smelled stale and had simply taken them down and laundered them and was now hanging them to air dry in the October morning. No one had asked her to do this. She had seen that it needed doing and she had done it. Ethan stood at the garden door for a moment before walking out, watching her work with the kind of unself-conscious efficiency that belongs to people who do things because they genuinely need doing rather than because someone is watching. Then he walked along the stone path toward her. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, unhurried, without anxiety, the way she looked at everything. He said, "Lily." She inclined her head slightly and said, "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery." He said, "Please. Just Ethan." He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her directly, at the straightness of how she stood, the complete absence of performance in her expression. He said, "My mother told me everything last night. What happened while I was in Chicago. What you did. What you said to Victoria in that sunroom." He told her that he owed her an apology. He said, "I let things happen in my own house that I should have seen a long time ago. You were put in a position to do something that my mother's son should have done himself. I'm sorry for that." She blinked. She had not expected an apology, not from him, not first, not stated that plainly. She said, "Your mother needed someone to look after her. I did that. You don't have to apologize for what I chose to do." He nodded. Then he told her that her position was secure, that he had spoken with the agency that morning, that whatever Victoria had communicated to them had been corrected. And Lily, who had listened to all of this with the same clear, steady attention she brought to everything, said, with respect, "I'm not staying or leaving based on Victoria's instruction or yours. If I stay, it's because your mother needs consistent care from someone who actually provides it. That's the reason, and the only reason." He held her gaze for a long moment. And then, quietly, a smile crossed his face, the rare kind, the one that changed him completely, that made him look less like the cover of Fortune magazine and more like a person. "Fair enough," he said. He turned and went inside. But he stood for a moment at the garden door and looked back at her. And something inside him that had been slightly numb for a long time opened its eyes and began to pay attention. Victoria Harrington was not a woman who accepted a setback without responding to it. She felt the shift in the house the way certain people feel weather changing, a pressure difference, quiet but unmistakable. Ethan had not made a scene. He had not accused her of anything directly, not yet. But at dinner, when she mentioned casually that she had arranged for Lily's reassignment through the agency, he had looked at her across the long table and said, without particular emotion, "I spoke with the agency this morning. Lily stays." And then he had gone back to his food. In 2 years together, Ethan had never simply overruled her on a household matter. Not cleanly, not without a conversation, not without at least offering her the space to make her case. She filed this away with the precision of someone who had been managing situations strategically her entire adult life, and she began to adjust her approach. If direct assertion was not working, she would try something else. She would try performance. She was very good at performance. She had been practicing it for longer than most people had been watching. She began with Eleanor. She arranged for Eleanor's favorite meal, pot roast with roasted carrots, to be prepared on a Wednesday evening without being asked. She sent a small arrangement of fresh flowers to Eleanor's room with a handwritten note. She appeared in Eleanor's doorway on a Thursday afternoon with a warm smile and asked whether the room temperature was right, whether there was anything she needed. Eleanor looked at all of it with blue eyes that were kind and clear and 78 years old and said, graciously, that she was just fine, thank you, Victoria. Her voice was warm. Her eyes were something else entirely. They were the eyes of a woman who had been paying attention for a long time and knew exactly what she was seeing. The flowers were arranged by the window. The meals arrived on time that week. And the performance continued, note perfect, for an audience of one who had long since stopped being fooled by it. Victoria's second adjustment was directed at Lily. She found her alone in the kitchen on a Friday morning and adopted a tone she used selectively, softer, almost candid, leaning slightly toward Lily as though sharing a confidence. She said, I think we got off on the wrong foot. I'd really like for us to start over. Lily looked at her with the complete, steady attention that Victoria had come to find slightly unsettling. Not hostile attention. Not wary attention. Simply direct, honest, unperformable upon attention. The kind that sees through surfaces without effort and without drama. Lily said, "I have no issue with you personally. I only ask that Mrs. Montgomery is treated with the respect she's owed. If that's agreed, there's nothing between us." Victoria nodded and smiled and said, of course, absolutely." Her smile was technically perfect. It reached approximately to the place where her eyes began and stopped precisely there. Lily did not return the smile. Not because she was rude, but because she was honest. And Lily Carter did not smile at things she did not mean. She was watchful. She was patient. And she was watching Victoria Harrington perform kindness at a woman who had spent a lifetime recognizing the difference between that performance and the real thing. What grew between Ethan Montgomery and Lily Carter was not a decision either of them made. It was not a moment. It was something that developed in the small, ordinary spaces between one day and the next, the way things grow when the conditions are right and no one is forcing them. He began coming home from the office a little earlier. Not dramatically, just a shift of 30 or 40 minutes that he did not announce. He would find himself drawn toward the East Garden in the late afternoons, which was also when Lily sat with Eleanor in the autumn sunshine, the two of them talking quietly about whatever they happened to be talking about that day. He would stop and exchange a few words. Sometimes he would sit, and the three of them would exist in the comfortable quiet that only happens between people who have moved past the need to perform for each other. He began to notice the things she did without being asked, the loose hinge on Eleanor's wardrobe door that she had fixed with tools she found in the basement. The section of garden fence that had come away from its post, repaired quietly on a Tuesday afternoon. The burned-out bulb in the upper corridor that the maintenance request had somehow missed for 2 weeks, replaced without comment. She fixed things. She did not announce that she had fixed them. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. He noticed that when Eleanor spoke, Lily listened with her full body, not the half-present listening of someone waiting for their turn, but actual, full presence. He noticed that she disagreed with him twice during a conversation about local education funding and did so simply and clearly, as though disagreeing with a person was a normal and unremarkable thing to do. He found this, to his own slight surprise, genuinely refreshing. He had spent 2 years with a woman who always agreed with him, and he had mistaken that agreement for understanding. One evening he came out to the garden later than usual and found Lily sitting alone on the low stone wall near the rose bushes, reading a book with the absorbed ease of someone completely at home in themselves. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, unhurried. He said he was sorry, he had not realized anyone was out here. She gestured slightly at the garden and said, "It's your garden." He laughed, a short, surprised, genuine sound that he had not been expecting, and sat on a nearby bench. They talked for almost an hour, without either of them deciding to. About his company and the specific loneliness of running something large. About her family, and her father's hardware store, and the principles she had been raised with. He went inside that night knowing something had shifted in a direction it was not going to reverse. She noticed things about him too, because Lily Carter paid attention to the world around her the way her father had taught her to, carefully and honestly and without the distortions that self-interest can introduce. She noticed that he was kinder to his junior employees on the phone than his senior ones, which was the opposite of the pattern she usually saw in powerful men. She noticed that he always answered his mother's calls, even when he was in the middle of something that most people would consider a reasonable excuse not to. She noticed that when he smiled, the real smile, not the one he used in photographs, it started in his eyes a full second before it reached his mouth, the same way hers did, and that it changed his entire face from the composed authority he wore in public into something warm and slightly unguarded that she suspected very few people had been allowed to see. She was careful with what she noticed. She was careful with what she let herself feel. She had not come to this house looking for anything except honest work and enough income to take care of the people she loved. But she was 25 years old and she was paying attention, and the thing she was paying attention to was increasingly difficult to categorize as something other than what it was. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon, for weeks after Ethan had returned from Chicago. He came home in the middle of the day, a board meeting had ended 2 hours ahead of schedule, and he had decided simply to come home and rest without announcing it in advance. He came through the side entrance, the way he sometimes did when he did not want the full formality of the front door. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet during the day when they are organized around one person's preferences for silence. He heard his mother's voice first, coming from the direction of the sitting room at the end of the east corridor. Then Victoria's. He walked toward the sound. The door was partially open. And he stopped outside of it, because something in the quality of what he was hearing made him stop. Victoria's voice was doing something it had never done in his presence. All the careful modulation was gone. The warmth, the patience, the practiced reasonableness, none of it was present. What was left was the instrument underneath, cool, controlled, and cutting in the precise way that precise things cut. She was telling Eleanor that she wanted to be very clear about something because she felt there had been some confusion. She said she had been more than patient. She said she was going to be the woman of that house, that it was not a wish, it was what was happening, and that the sooner Eleanor stopped positioning herself as some kind of central figure in the household, the better it would go for her. She said, because once Ethan and I are married, Eleanor, the arrangements in this house are going to look very different. I want that understood. And then, at the end, in the particular tone of someone who has saved the most deliberately placed weight for last, you should honestly be grateful that anyone is willing to make arrangements for you at this age. Rather than just leaving you to figure things out on your own. Ethan Montgomery pushed the door open. Victoria looked up. For one fraction of a second, barely visible, barely a blink, something crossed her face that was very close to fear. Then she reached for composure, and she reached for it fast, because she was very skilled at this. But she was not fast enough. Ethan had spent 10 years reading rooms and the people in them for a living. He had seen it. He would not be unseeing it. He said one word, don't. And then he did not look at Victoria again. He crossed the room to his mother, Eleanor, sitting in her chair with her spine perfectly straight and her eyes wet and her dignity entirely intact despite everything, and he crouched in front of her and took both of her hands in his. He looked up at her face from below. He said, I'm here, Mom. I've got you. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it. Eleanor looked at her son's face. And for the first time in many months, she exhaled. Not a dramatic exhale. Just a breath that had been held for too long, released because the person it had been held waiting for had finally arrived. The room was very still. Victoria stood in the background, still beautiful, still composed on the surface, but something in the quality of her composure had changed. It had become the composure of someone holding a position that has been determined rather than one that is secure. And Ethan, still crouching in front of his mother, holding her hands, had already made every decision that needed making. He simply had not said them out loud yet. The conversation between Ethan and Victoria that followed was not explosive. Ethan Montgomery was not an explosive man. He had never needed to raise his voice to make a room understand that he meant what he said, the quality of his stillness was enough. He told her, clearly and without cruelty, that he could not build a marriage with a woman who treated his mother as something inconvenient to be organized out of sight. He told her that he had heard, with his own ears, in his own house, what she said to his mother and how she said it, and that no amount of reframing would change what he had witnessed. He told her that he had been looking away for too long and that he understood now how that had happened and why, and that it was not something he was willing to continue. He told her that he needed her to go home that evening, and that he would have her things sent to the Harrington estate by the end of the week, and that he was asking her, please, not to make this harder or messier than it needed to be. Victoria tried. She was extraordinary even in this. The skill of her performance was genuinely impressive even as it was being deployed on a man who had already seen behind it. She produced tears, which seemed real or close enough to real that the distinction barely mattered. She told him he was misreading the situation, that he didn't understand the difficulty of managing Eleanor's increasing needs, that the household was far more complex than he realized, that Lily Carter, and she said the name with a specific inflection, small and deliberate, had been introducing a destabilizing influence since her first week. Ethan listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He gave her the full courtesy of his complete attention while she made her case. And when she finished, he said the same thing he had said when she began, "I need you to go home tonight, Victoria. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." She looked at him for a long, assessing moment. And the performance stopped. Not gradually, it simply stopped, the way a light goes out. What was underneath it was not softness. It was the cold, absolute certainty of a woman who had decided something was hers and cannot accept the information that it is not. She held that expression for a second. Then she stood, picked up her bag, and walked to the front door. Her heels struck the marble with their particular precise rhythm all the way to the entrance. The door closed. The house was still. Mrs. Webb appeared in the corridor moments later and then disappeared again, but the expression on her face in that brief moment said everything that 11 years of professional discretion would not allow her to say out loud. Upstairs, Ethan could hear his mother's room, the quiet sounds of a woman who had been holding herself very carefully together and was now, finally, in the privacy of her own space, allowing herself not to. He went to her. He sat beside her for a long time without speaking. The house felt different. Something had left it, and the absence was not empty, it was the beginning of something else, something that had been waiting in the walls of that house for a very long time to be allowed in. The rose garden was visible through Eleanor's window in the late afternoon light. The fountain was running in the driveway. Everything outside looked exactly the way it always had. But inside, everything had changed. And it had changed because one honest young woman from Savannah had refused to look the other way on a Sunday afternoon in October. Everything that followed, every good and real and lasting thing that followed, had its root in that refusal. 2 days after Victoria left the Montgomery estate, Lily Carter went to Eleanor's room with a small bag at her feet and told her, gently, that she was planning to return to Savannah. Eleanor straightened in her chair and asked why, without preamble, in the direct way of a woman who has decided that polite indirection costs more than it is worth. Lily gave her an honest answer. She said the reason she had stayed was to ensure Eleanor was safe and properly cared for in her own home. That situation had changed. Ethan was home more. The household felt different. Mrs. Webb was a good woman who would look after things properly. Eleanor would be well cared for. She said it warmly, because she meant it warmly. But she meant it. Eleanor looked at her for a long, quiet time. The kind of silence that is arriving at something rather than avoiding it. Then she asked, directly and without cushioning, "Do you have feelings for my son?" Lily blinked, a full blink, the kind that buys 1 second of processing time. She said, "He's a good man, Mrs. Montgomery." Eleanor said, with the gentle precision of someone who has been paying attention for 12 days and knows exactly what she has seen, "I didn't ask whether he was good. I asked whether you have feelings for him." Lily looked at her hands. Then she looked back up at Eleanor. She said, "He is who he is, and I am who I am. Those are very different," and Eleanor completed her sentence, "exactly, positions in a household." "Yes. That's true." She reached across and put her hand over Lily's. She said, "I'm asking about two people, not two positions. And the answer to that question doesn't change based on what someone earns or what their name looks like on the front of a building." Lily was quiet. She felt the warmth and the wisdom of the hand over hers, and she felt the specific difficulty of being seen clearly by someone who is also being honest with you. Eleanor said, "Stay. Just a little while longer. Let things be what they're going to be." It was not a manipulation. It had no agenda in it, at least, no agenda beyond the simple and genuine desire of a woman who cared about two people and could see, with the particular clarity of age, what they could not yet fully see in themselves. And Lily, who had been raised in a home where honesty was a given, found that she could not argue with honesty when it was offered to her plainly. She stayed. She unpacked the small bag. And she went back to work. He found her in the kitchen at 7:30 the next morning, making Eleanor's breakfast. She had made extra, she always made extra, quietly and without mentioning it, leaving a covered plate on the counter in case he had not eaten. He came and sat at the kitchen table. Not because he needed to be in the kitchen. Not because he was there on the way to somewhere else. Simply because she was there and he had found himself wanting to be where she was. He sat at the same table where he had done homework as a child on weekends, and the familiarity of it felt unexpectedly right. She placed a covered plate in front of him without comment. He uncovered it. Scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, sliced avocado. He ate. She sat across from him with her own coffee, looking at something on her phone, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything. And that silence, and the specific ease of it, told him something important. He had spent 2 years with a woman who always filled silences. He had not known until this moment that the filling was a kind of pressure he had simply grown accustomed to bearing. After a while he set his fork down and said, "You were going to leave." It was not an accusation. It was a fact he was placing on the table between them, carefully, the way you place something fragile. She looked up from her phone. She said, "Your mother asked me to stay." He nodded, slowly, looking at her. Then he said, "What would I have to say to make you want to stay for yourself?" "Not for her. For you. Whatever the honest answer to that is." The kitchen was very quiet. Lily looked at her coffee mug for a long moment. Then she looked at him. She said, "Nothing dishonest. I won't stay for something that isn't real. That's not how I'm built." He held her eyes. He said, "I know exactly how you're built. I've been watching you for 4 weeks. That's why I'm asking." She did not answer immediately. She looked back at her coffee. And at the very corner of her full lips, there was a smile that she did not fully manage to prevent, small, private, unintended, entirely honest. She stayed. And he knew then that he had been right about the direction things were moving. He simply needed to be patient enough to let them move at the speed they needed to move, which was the speed of 2 honest people being certain before they were ready. He asked to meet her family on a Saturday in November, 6 weeks after Victoria had left. He asked directly, the way he asked everything. He said, "I'd like to go to Savannah with you. I'd like to meet your parents." She had looked at him with those clear dark eyes and said, "Are you serious?" He said he was. She had been quiet for a long moment, genuinely considering, not performing consideration. Then she said, "All right." They flew down on a Friday. Ethan wore jeans and a plain dark shirt. No driver. No entourage. Just himself, and a deliberate choice not to arrive as the person the world had decided he was, but as the person he actually was underneath all of that. Lily noticed the choice. She noticed everything. They drove themselves from the airport in a rental car, through the Spanish moss streets of Savannah, and pulled up in front of the Carter house on Maple Street. James Carter opened the front door. He looked at Ethan the way James Carter looked at everything, steadily, completely, without the distortions that performance or social anxiety can introduce. He shook his hand and said, "Come on in. Ruth's made enough food for the whole street." What happened in the Carter family home over that weekend was not complicated. It was simply real. Ethan sat at the dinner table and ate Ruth Carter's cooking and said, truthfully, that it was some of the best food he had encountered in years, and Ruth had laughed and already started loading his plate again before he had finished the sentence. He had sat with Marcus, Lily's younger brother, 21, engineering ambitions, the specific bright-eyed energy of a young person who believes completely in what they are working toward, and asked him real questions. Not the polite, managed questions of someone moving through a social obligation, but genuine questions, with genuine follow-up questions, that demonstrated he was actually listening to the answers. He had helped clear the table after dinner without being asked or directed. He had simply stood up, reached for a stack of dishes, and carried them to the kitchen, the way a person does in a home they feel comfortable in. And James Carter, sitting in his armchair across the room, had watched all of this with the quiet, measuring eyes of a man who has been reading character rather than credentials his whole life, and who trusts completely what he sees when he is looking at it honestly. When they left on Sunday afternoon, James walked them to the rental car. He shook Ethan's hand again. He said, "You come back soon." 3 words. But the way he said them, unhurried, certain, with the specific quality of an invitation rather than a formality, carried everything that James Carter was not the type of man to say in longer form. Then he turned to Lily. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder and looked at her face. He did not say anything. He looked at her face and gave one small, slow nod, the nod of a man who has been watching all weekend and has formed a clear and final view, and who trusts his daughter enough to let the nod say everything the words would only diminish. Lily hugged him. She held on for a moment longer than usual, longer than the goodbye required, the right length for what the moment actually meant. Then they got in the car. As they pulled away from the curb, Lily looked out the window at her father standing on the steps of the house on Maple Street, growing smaller in the side mirror. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Some things are complete simply in the experiencing of them, and this was one of those things. He asked her on a Saturday evening in late November. He had not planned an elaborate setting. He had learned, over several months of paying genuine and careful attention to Lily Carter, that she valued the real over the orchestrated and that the most important things in her experience had always been said plainly and meant completely. He had a ring, a single brilliant cut diamond on a simple platinum band, clean and uncluttered and real, the kind of ring that was about what it meant rather than what it cost, and he had waited for a moment that felt honest rather than staged. The moment came after dinner, when Eleanor had gone to bed early with a novel she was visibly not going to read, and told them she was very tired and they should not wait up, with such a transparently unconvincing performance of tiredness that both Ethan and Lily had exchanged a look across the dinner table and understood perfectly. They went out to the back garden. The November air was cold. The rose bushes were stripped to thorns and structure. The fountain was still running, lit from below. The house glowed warm behind them. They sat on the stone bench near the rose bushes. They talked for a while, easy, unhurried, the way they always talked now, and then Ethan turned toward her and said her name. He said, "I want to ask you something. And I want you to know before I ask it that I mean every word of it, and however you answer, I'll respect it completely." She turned to look at him. Her expression was the same as it always was, present, clear, completely steady, like a compass that always points in the same direction regardless of the weather. He said, "You are the most honest person I have ever met. You walked into my house when it was in a worse state than I knew, and you held it to a standard I had stopped holding it to myself. You looked after my mother when I failed to. You never asked me for a single thing, and you never tried to be anything other than exactly what you are. And the fact that you never tried, that is the reason I cannot imagine building anything going forward without you in it." He reached into his jacket pocket. He opened the ring box. The cold garden air was very still. The fountain ran. The lights of the house were warm behind them. He said, "Will you marry me?" Lily looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about her father's front porch and the things that had been taught to her before she was old enough to understand all the ways she would need them. She thought about honesty as a form of love, about choosing what is true as an act of courage. This was true. She said, "Yes." Simple as that. No performance, no drama. Just the word, and her eyes behind it, and everything the word meant. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him, and the smile that crossed her face was the kind that starts in the eyes a full second before it arrives anywhere else, the kind that cannot be manufactured and that no one who is watching it can mistake for anything other than what it is. He pulled her close and held her. For a long time neither of them spoke. The garden was bare and still and cold and completely beautiful. The fountain ran its soft sound into the November air. The house glowed. Some things are simply enough on their own, the right moment, the right person, the right answer, the right silence afterward. This was one of those things. They stayed in the garden until the cold was too much, and then they went inside, and they went straight upstairs to Eleanor's room. They knocked. They opened the door. And Eleanor Montgomery, who had been sitting in her armchair with a novel open and entirely unread in her lap, listening for footsteps on the stairs with an expression of absolutely unconvincing tiredness, looked up at their faces and was out of the armchair before either of them had said a single word. She opened her arms to Lily first. Not to Ethan. To Lily. She crossed the small space between them and put her arms around the young woman who had arrived at her door with 2 bags and a genuine smile and had sat with her in a dark room while a party went on downstairs and had stood up in a sunroom full of witnesses and spoken the truth out loud when no one else would. She held her the way you hold something you were afraid you were going to lose before you had properly understood how much you needed it. Her eyes were closed. Tears ran down her face. The good kind, the kind that only come when something you have been quietly hoping for without daring to name it has finally and completely arrived. She said, into Lily's shoulder, "My daughter." Not like a daughter. Not almost a daughter. Not something resembling a daughter. My daughter. The word offered without condition, without qualification, without anything attached to it except the full meaning of itself. Lily held her back just as firmly. When Eleanor finally pulled back, she held Lily's face in both her slightly trembling hands and looked at her, really looked, the way you look at something you want to remember exactly, and said, "Your father raised you right, Lily Carter. He raised you exactly right." And Lily, who could not speak in that moment without losing the careful hold she had on herself, simply nodded. Then Eleanor turned to Ethan. She stood in front of her son, the boy she had worked 2 jobs for, the boy she had believed in before the world knew his name, the boy who had grown into this man, and she put her hand against his face. She said, "Your father would have been so proud of the man you became. The man you're still becoming." He said, with a steadiness he was working to maintain, "I had a good teacher, Mom." She patted his cheek once, the way she had when he was small. Then she looked at both of them standing in the warm lamplight of her room, and her expression was the expression of a woman whose quiet, patient, sustained hope has been vindicated. Not triumphant. Not relieved. Something deeper and more lasting than either of those things. Something that had been worth all the waiting. That night, after Ethan and Lily had gone downstairs, Eleanor sat in her armchair for a long time without turning the television on or opening her book. She looked out the window at the November garden, the bare rose bushes, the lit fountain, the dark Connecticut sky. And she thought about the Monday morning in October when a young woman from Savannah had knocked on her door and asked if there was anything she needed. And she thought, yes. There was. And you brought it. Before we dive deeper into the rest of this story, we want to take a quick moment to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would absolutely love to hear from you, whether you are in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or anywhere else in the world. This community is everything to us. And if this story is moving you, if it is making you feel something, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us get back to what happened next. The wedding was on the last Saturday of June, on the back lawn of the Montgomery estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. Not inside the house, not in a ballroom, not in a venue chosen for its impressiveness, outside, under the oak trees, with the rose garden in full summer bloom and the fountain running in the driveway and the Connecticut sky doing something extraordinary with the afternoon light. Ethan had asked Lily where she wanted to get married, and she had said, without hesitation, outside. With our family around us. Not in a ballroom. So outside it was. Long natural oak farmhouse tables with white linen runners. Wildflower arrangements in cream and soft gold. String lights strung between the mature estate trees creating a canopy of warmth. The ceremony itself was conducted under an arch of white garden roses and eucalyptus, built by a local florist who had been doing this for 30 years and had never been given a more specific or more joyful brief. The food was partly catered and partly, at Ruth Carter's cheerful, categorical insistence, made by family. The result was the kind of wedding that cannot be produced by planning alone, because the most essential ingredient in it was something that no event coordinator can source. It was real. James Carter walked his daughter down the aisle in a suit he had bought for the occasion and pressed twice. He held her arm the way a man holds something he would give everything to protect, and his face carried the expression that fathers are supposed to carry at this moment, the one that is pride and heartbreak and joy all at once, the three things existing simultaneously in a person who loves someone enough to let them go towards something better. Ruth sat in the front row with Marcus beside her and was crying before the ceremony even started, which was entirely consistent with who Ruth Carter was and who she had always been, and Marcus had offered her his pocket square with the long-suffering expression of a younger sibling who had anticipated exactly this outcome. Eleanor sat in the front row on Ethan's side, dressed in pale blue, her silver hair softly pinned, her back completely straight and her eyes the brightest they had been in years. She did not look like a woman who had spent several months being made to feel invisible in her own son's house. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for exactly this, and who had always known, in the patient and certain way of people who have lived long enough to understand how stories tend to end when honesty is involved, that it was coming. Lily walked down the aisle in a gown the color of warm ivory with a subtle floral lace overlay, her natural hair worn down and adorned with small white garden flowers. Her warm brown skin caught the June light in a way that made people who had been standing nearby for 20 minutes suddenly unable to look anywhere else. She was breathtakingly beautiful in the way she had always been breathtakingly beautiful, without trying, without announcement, without performing anything, simply by being fully and completely herself. Ethan stood at the end of the aisle and watched her walk toward him, and he did something in front of several hundred people that he had spent most of his professional life training himself not to do in any context. He let his face show everything. No composure. No management. No practiced expression calibrated for the people watching. He simply stood there and looked at the woman coming toward him and let everything he felt be completely visible, because she had earned that, the full truth of what he felt, offered plainly and without management, which was the most Ethan Montgomery thing he could have given her. When she reached him and took his hands, he said quietly, just for her, "You are the most real thing that has ever happened to me." She squeezed his hands. She said, "I know." And then she smiled, the smile that started in her eyes a full second before it arrived anywhere else, and they turned together to face the minister, and the last Saturday of June became the day that everything that had been true for months was finally, formally, completely true. The Montgomery estate on Belmont Ridge Drive is still the same house. The white columns, the circular stone fountain, the rose gardens maintained 3 days a week. From the street, it looks exactly as it always has, the kind of property that makes people slow their cars to stare. But inside it, something has changed in the way that rooms change when the people in them have changed, not the furniture, not the marble, not the paintings on the walls, but the air itself. The feeling you carry when you walk through the front door. Eleanor Montgomery walks freely in this house now. She comes downstairs when she wants to. She sits at the kitchen table on mornings when Lily is making coffee and talks about whatever is on her mind and no one redirects her or suggests she might be more comfortable upstairs. She comes to the garden on Sunday afternoons, and sometimes Ethan and Lily join her, and the three of them are quiet together in the way of people who have no need to perform for each other. The house, which had been full of performance for 2 years, is now simply full. The difference between those two things is enormous, and it is felt in every room of it, every day. Marcus Carter was accepted into the MIT engineering transfer program that autumn, with a partial scholarship and the contact information of a professor Ethan knew who ran a mentorship initiative for promising transfer students. He moved to Cambridge with a full-time ambition and a family that was now, in every meaningful sense, larger and better resourced than it had been the previous October. James Carter still sweeps the front step of the hardware store on Maple Street every morning. The store still has the hand-painted sign and the American flag by the door and the reputation for treating customers like people. But now when Ethan calls on Sundays, which he does, regularly, because Ethan keeps the commitments he makes, James picks up on the second ring and calls him son. Ruth Carter has been to the Greenwich estate twice since the wedding. Both times she took over the kitchen with a cheerful authority that the household staff found simultaneously alarming and deeply welcome, and both times the meals that came out of that kitchen were better than anything the estate had produced under any other management. Eleanor had declared, after the second visit, that Ruth Carter was the finest cook she had encountered in 78 years of eating, which Ruth had received with the specific pleasure of a woman whose cooking is her primary love language and who has just been told it has been properly heard. Lily had started her own accounting practice, working from a sunlit room in the estate that had been quietly converted into a home office. Her client list had grown faster than she had projected, partly because she was excellent at what she did, and partly because Ethan's network, offered without pressure or condition, had its own considerable gravity. She had not asked him to introduce her to anyone. He had done it anyway, because he understood what she had built and because supporting it was simply the right thing to do. That was the particular way of their partnership. She never asked for anything, and he gave freely anyway, and both of them understood that this was what it looked like when two honest people chose each other without agenda. At night, when the house was quiet and Eleanor was asleep and the Connecticut dark had settled over the estate, Ethan and Lily sat together in the garden on the stone bench by the rose bushes. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were simply quiet in the full and easy way that only happens between people who have nothing left to perform for each other. The fountain ran its soft sound. The seasons moved through the garden. The gates on Belmont Ridge Drive were open. Victoria Harrington returned to Philadelphia. She was engaged 8 months after the Montgomery estate chapter of her life concluded, to someone from her own world, old money, the right name, dinners with the right people. Her social presence remained impeccable. Her life, from the outside, looked exactly as it had always looked, curated, confident, flawlessly managed. Whether it was, from the inside, what it appeared to be from the outside, that is a question that belongs to Victoria, and to whatever version of honesty she eventually arrives at in the quiet rooms of her own private life. That part of the story is hers. This story has always belonged to someone else. It has always belonged to Lily Carter. A young woman from Savannah who came north with 2 bags and her father's voice in her chest and walked into a house full of performance and simply, quietly, completely refused to participate in it. She did not arrive with a plan. She did not arrive with ambition beyond the honest work she had come to do. She arrived with a principle that had been given to her on a front porch in Georgia before she was old enough to understand all the ways she would need it. And that principle, you do not walk past something wrong, turned out to be the thing that changed everything. For Eleanor. For Ethan. For the house on Belmont Ridge Drive. And for herself. There is a version of this story that gets told the wrong way, the version where Lily Carter is the lucky girl who married the billionaire, and Ethan Montgomery is the generous man who saw past the circumstances to find her, and the whole thing is a kind of fairy tale about what can happen if you are in the right place at the right time. That version misses the point entirely. The real version of this story is not about luck or circumstances or being found. It is about character. It is about the specific, daily, accumulated choice to be honest, not as a performance, not as a strategy, but as a way of moving through the world. Lily did not win anything. She did not position herself or calculate an outcome. She walked into a house, saw something wrong, and refused to look away. And in refusing to look away, she set in motion a series of events that produced good, not because good is always what happens when people are honest, but because in this particular house, at this particular time, there was a man who was finally ready to stop looking away himself. The two things found each other. And what they built together was real in a way that very few things are. Eleanor Montgomery, in a conversation she had with Lily several weeks after the wedding, tried to articulate what the whole experience had meant to her. She said, "I spent a long time in that house feeling like I had become invisible. Not just to Victoria, but to myself. And then you knocked on my bedroom door and sat down and talked to me like a person, and I remembered what it felt like to be one. That is what you gave me first. Before anything else. Before the sunroom, before Ethan understanding, before any of it. You gave me that. You sat with me in a dark room and treated me like a person. And I don't think you have any idea how far that reaches. Lily had listened to all of this without interrupting, the way she listened to everything. Then she said, "My father always told me that you find out who a person really is by watching how they treat the people who can't do anything for them. I think that's true. But I also think it goes the other way. You find out who you really are by how you treat those same people. I found out something about myself in this house. Something I needed to know." Eleanor had nodded. She understood exactly what Lily meant. Because she had been watching it happen from the very first afternoon, when a young woman with a pressed navy dress and an honest smile had sat down in the chair across from her armchair and asked what she needed. And Eleanor had said, "Sit with me for a few minutes. I'm tired of this room feeling like a place I've been put." And Lily Carter had sat. And everything that followed, every good and real and lasting thing that followed, had begun exactly there. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. If the maid who stole his heart moved you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you think about the people in your own life who show up simply and honestly and without agenda, please let us know in the comments. We read every single one. And tell us where in the world you are watching from today, because this community spans countries and continents and time zones, and every comment is a person we are genuinely glad to know is here. If you are new to Narrativa Mind Tales, welcome, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. And if you have been here for a while, thank you for staying. Every story we tell for you. We will see you in the next one.